Thank you again, Scott Brinker. I feel like you have a PTSD. We wouldn't do it to you this time. There will not be 10 people on your panel, I promise. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, everybody.
Great to having you here, Scott. We are transitioning to a fireside chat between Scott and Allison. Scott, VP of Platform Ecosystem at HubSpot, martech guru, if I can say so.
You're very kind.
Allison, Allison Snow, CMO at StringPoint Solutions, one of the most insightful leaders I've met all over these years. So yeah, let's get started. Allison, amazing lineup. We are 8 minutes already over time, so just right back to you.
We'll make the most of it.
Let's do it.
Yeah, we will. I'm so excited. You guys in the audience, you know the graphic, you know Scott Brinker, and he is so much more than the graphic, but that is just one association you might have with him. The deal that I tried to make with Scott in advance was we have an hour, now we have a little bit less. How much of his knowledge can we grab in this short amount of time in terms of digital ops? And I am very excited to try to facilitate that as best as I can. So Scott, we haven't met, so I'm super excited to meet you. I know it's showing, so I'm not going to try to hide it. Thanks for coming on board.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, we haven't met in person here, but we've been collaborating over this talk. I'm very excited about, the topics we're going to be diving into. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome. So I'm going to dive in because we do have some time to make up for. We caught the tail end of the last session. Absolutely awesome. I could barely not sort of take myself off mute and contribute, but I'm a good person, so I didn't do that. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. We talked just a little bit, as we mentioned, we haven't met, but we talked a little bit about what we know about this audience, which is some folks are learning about digital ops orchestration, may have caught a few blog posts, kind of thinking about it, scratching the surface, and others are huge experts. And we know this from viewing these sessions before. There's just a large spectrum of knowledge here. So we're going to start slow. Don't let that bore you and don't go away. But we're just going to talk about, from Scott's perspective and everything he knows, what even is digital ops orchestration?
Well, it's a very fancy sounding phrase, isn't it? Oh, wow. No, I don't do like marketing automation. I do digital ops orchestration. I should get a raise. I mean, where we, just to set this in context, is we've been doing for 30 years here, this steady evolution of shifting to a world where we engage with customers through digital channels. And if there's one thing that has been pretty much constant over these past 30 years, is that environment has just gotten more complex, right? I mean, once upon a time, you could like put up a website and maybe you'd have a forum, and that was our digital marketing, the extent of our digital marketing environment, and then as, more channels have come in, more tactics, we've got more sophisticated in understanding different segments, where they're at in different stages in their buyer journey. And all this stuff is actually really exciting. But it has steadily increased the complexity of all the things that even just in the marketing world we have to deal with, to just sort of like run a modern marketing department. And there's only so much of that us humans can actually keep track of, so one of the sort of like parallel developments that's been happening, accelerating over 10, 15 years is to say, okay, we need to bring more and more automation to this. And, the whole category of marketing automation and marketing automation platforms, and, where those began with, Eloqua and Marketo and HubSpot and Pardot. And, the whole idea there was to say like, okay, there's a set of things we kind of expect are going to happen. And now we want to set up an automated rule, like a very deterministic rule, like when X happens, Y should always happen. Or, maybe a little decision logic like, oh, if X happens, then we want Y to happen. Otherwise, we want Z to happen. But the idea was to start to put these rules in place to say that, okay, we don't need humans, engaging in every single one of these things. We can have these patterns that sort of run on their own. And so that was fine when you had like two or three or five of those. But as the sophistication of what we thought we could do in marketing automation kept growing, is again the number of channels, segments, all this kept growing. We kept adding more and more roles. And that's gotten to the place where, yeah, I think a lot of sophisticated marketing teams struggle with just the span, of how many things they're trying to automate in marketing. And if we step back one level and say, like, okay, it's one thing to have a marketing team doing this, but as more and more of every kind of touch point we have with customers, is happening through digital channels, and there's software behind the scenes that's helping to, manage those interactions, and everyone's trying to put some automations into that. We've got, different marketing systems running different automations. And we have sales systems and sequences that are running automations. And we might have customer service things that run automations. And now you start to have all these things that are running automations, but it's the same business and we're engaging with the same customers. And so this really becomes one of the questions for us is like, okay, as you get more and more of these things trying to engage with customers programmatically, how do we orchestrate them together?
I love that. And Julia introduced this topic on LinkedIn as, who's orchestrating the orchestrators, and you did such a good job of outlining that. I think you said so many important things, but one thing that I really appreciate, and I think the audience appreciates, is a lot of sophisticated teams are struggling with this. Not just a lot of teams, but a lot of teams that are sophisticated, that have embraced multi-channels, of course, multi-segments, of course, multi-attributes. It's not if X happens, then Y. There's a world of decisions. And I think introducing the if X to Y, the sort of evolution to patterns to where we are now, what a history. And this is like a decade and a half, right? Not like a century.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting.
Just keeping track of all that stuff is hard. And I think that is sort of where I think of the word orchestration is like, okay, yeah, I love the orchestrating the orchestrators. Yeah, it's like, what's that level that helps bring some cohesion to this? And to just be very honest, like, there's a lot of this. Like, this is a problem more than it is a solution. And we can talk about some of the steps on the way towards a solution. But if anyone's listening to this and they're feeling like, yeah, wow, I have no idea how that's getting done. Yeah, you're basically with all the rest of us.
Yeah, but I'll join the club. Yeah, and there's answers here, and there's more questions. So I think that's really generous to acknowledge. Awesome. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just that you get to talk to so many companies. And while it is a challenge, even for sophisticated companies, and you get to think about this so much more often in your role, what are some of the must-haves or the attributes of folks who are progressing here really well? So obviously, even sophisticated, struggling a bit, but there's something that must make you say, well, that's a great start. That is a great attribute. Keep doing that.
Yeah, well, I think there's technical foundations and then there's sort of organizational foundations. And I think at the technical foundation, if there's one place to invest that is almost always a solid return, it's at the data level. Because all the fun things we want to do with orchestration and insights and intelligence, really at the end of the day, the efficacy of those things is powered entirely by the data we feed into them. And it's amazing that as marketers in today's world, we have access to just a stunning array of data, I mean, whether it's, the whole spectrum of first-party data, not just, some of the classic first-party data, but all this stuff happening around like behavioral data, like intent signals that happen inside our world, but then all the sorts of, data from like third parties that are still a very big factor for most businesses, certainly even when you're engaging then with, even the walled garden platforms and, how you're exchanging data with them. For a number of companies, there's what we call second party data, right? If you have partners, if you have ecosystems, like how you're aligning data there. And so to me, like the number one thing that marketers can do from a technical perspective is be investing in steadily maturing their data infrastructure, their data capability. Like, okay, what are the sources of data we have? Where do we keep them? How do we manage them? How do we make sure we're like staying compliant? It's funny, this stuff never seems like the sexy stuff. The sexy stuff is always downstream of what we do with that
Mhm.
data. But the data is the foundation that makes that all possible.
Yeah.
I think from
And
an
we're talking foundations, and I think you're giving an answer. And I think a lot of forums have a data's good and but want to get to the sexy stuff just to be the sexy person doing the talking.
I
But
mean,
this
we
is the
work
real
in
answer,
marketing,
guys. This
we're
is
entitled
data's
to a
where it's
little
at.
bit of that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
um,
it's the answer, right? A stunning amount of data, making decisions about how stunning that is and what you really need and how you play it is huge.
we can probably later on get into, some of the more interesting things happening at the data layer, like, lots of discussions around the world of CDPs and how they're evolving, lots of discussions around things like cloud data warehouse, data lakehouse things. But
Yeah.
the other thing I would say from a foundational perspective is organizationally really investing in your marketing ops function. And this is something that I think still a lot of companies underinvest in. I've come across so many marketing ops functions, marketing ops people who they're just like stretched far too thin. The list of things they have to do is like 10 miles long. Yeah, it's, there's so much leverage to be had with this technology. But it's funny, there was a Gartner survey that they've run every year for like the past 4 or 5 years, where they would ask, their enterprise marketers, how much of your MarTech stack do you think you're utilizing? And not a lot of definition to what is meant by utilization. So it's kind of a gut feel thing, take it with a grain of salt. But like the first year they did that about 4 or 5 years ago, the answer came back and most people said, well, it's about 60%, which actually was kind of depressing. You're like, wait a second, you've got all this marketing technology and you're only using about 60% of it. You better get on that. And then the next year, it dropped to 50%. And then the year after that, it dropped to 40%. And then, like the last year that they ran this, it dropped down to 33%. Which, I mean, if you're looking for a signal of saying, like, hey, there's a crisis in the MarTech stack,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's about as clear of a signal that you can get, like, danger, Will Robinson. And ultimately, like, the way I look at that is the technology has raced so far ahead of our organizational capacity to actually apply it and apply it in a way that, we feel we're getting value out of. That, yeah, I mean, most organizations are like, yeah, we're just using a fraction of what's possible. And I think the cure to that is, in a very broad sense, investment in marketing operations. And that being said, marketing operations isn't just about designing a tech stack. It isn't about just having the admin folks who can, like, configure the systems and, make sure this is running and, get the reports. I mean, that's a part of marketing ops, but an often under recognized opportunity with marketing ops is to have them really lead the enablement and empowerment for the rest of the marketing organization in how you take advantage of these tools. There are so many of these things that, yeah, basically people don't have any idea of what's possible. They're not really given, it's more than just training. It's even being given like the opportunity and the permission to like start to experiment, to push things forward. That, yeah, they've just sort of like, oh, all right, there's these handful of things we do. We'll keep doing those. Yeah, in theory, there's all this other stuff we could do. I saw a really cool demo of it from the vendor, but yeah, we're not going to get to
Mhm.
that time. And we've got to invest in that if we really want to take full advantage of sort of what this whole digital ops orchestration future could be.
Yeah. I noted how you qualified the Gartner survey, gut feel, not exactly precise language, but man, that is directionally clear, as you say. It's not as what I'd expect in terms of the increasing, passion about efficiency that I feel like has been, that we have gotten more efficient, I hope, and that's been the tune of the last 2 or 3 years, I think. And then, but that confidence in the martech kind of sinking, that's interesting thing to talk about a different time, perhaps. I know.
Yeah. I mean, there is one way to think of that, so I have this thing I drew on a napkin like 10 years ago, we called Martech's Law. I wasn't trying to name it after myself. I was trying to name it after marketing tech people who run into this. And it's this idea that technology generally changes at an exponential rate, right?
Mhm.
Moore's Law is sort of the foundation of that. We see exponential change. Organizations do not change exponentially. If you're going to take a swag at it, we maybe change at a logarithmic pace. Change is very, very hard, particularly the larger you get. You juxtapose these two curves against each other of the technology just continuing to race ahead and organizations struggling to adapt. And you can have it both be the case that the organization is evolving, so it is getting better, it is getting more efficient, it is finding, new ways to drive innovation. But, oh, thanks. Hey, cool. This is such a cool thing to like have slides automatically come up based on topic. But at the same time feel that like, wow, relative to what's actually possible out here, we're just falling further and further behind.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Before I lose the opportunity, I want to make sure that folks picked up on your Lost in Space reference and appreciate it as much as they should, Scott. So Google it if you need to, but don't want to let that go. I'm going to jump a little bit, get us back on topic because I took you away a little bit. Shame on me. Any recommendations for how folks who are saying, I'm in, I want to do this, I want to be super sophisticated? What are some indicators of if I'm doing it well? Another way to say that is any insights or recommendations on how to measure digital ops orchestration?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And it's a hard one to answer because a lot of this stuff is not, um, like it's hard to get a direct measure of somehow like orchestration efficiency. I mean, you could put things like how many total, like in the abstract, it's a universal metric. It's just kind
Yeah.
of hard, But what we look at is we look at, okay, we've got all these things we're actually doing. What are we doing as far as like the time? I mean, if you're in B2B, and you've got a certain time frame between like, a set of intent signals and a lead, qualifying, and then actually getting them engaged, with a salesperson. Like, what's the time frame in which that takes? What's the conversion rate, in which those people feel like they're getting the right things moved at the right time to move forward? These are actually all very concrete, metrics that we actually do care about, throughout our business. And the whole reason we're investing in this technology and, this sort of orchestration around it is to impact those metrics. And so I think it's very useful to, from a, orchestration operations perspective, to say, okay, again, let's just understand like the full set of things of what is marketing responsible for executing, what are the metrics, at each of those things that actually matters to the business. Now we come up with a set of hypotheses as to, okay, where's there friction, or where are these things that are slowing down, or where are opportunities to like impact that? And that then with those theses, with hypotheses, then we're looking and say like, okay, here's what we'd like to try to see if we can make that better. And do we have the technology that can actually execute on that? There's this other dimension of, cost, right? Because to get to the ROI, it's like, okay, well, yes, I can move these metrics, but how much do I have to spend to actually move that metric, matters. And that's harder and harder these days because when we're talking about point solutions, right? Like, oh, I have a certain reaction speed to customer complaints coming at me on social media channels. Okay, I invest in a social media management tool and I'm paying that much for it. And now I have this sort of impact on the metrics of response rate and customer retention. Like that's sort of an easy case. You're like, okay, I can track the ROI. But when you start doing these things like, for instance, investing in a cloud data warehouse architecture so that we can have data flow across, not just the different silos from, classic marketing apps, but like flow across the organization so that when things are happening in, customer service or if things are happening in a digital product, like that data is able to flow and be accessible in what we do with marketing programs and marketing campaigns. That's harder because, the investment we're putting in that, cloud data warehouse is like serving a whole bunch of needs for a whole bunch of different people. So the ROI is harder to track on those things, but certainly from a like top line metric of being able to say like, okay, I've got a certain, again, just say it's like a customer service resolution, thing. It's got a certain time frame, a certain success rate. Here's what I'm going to do to impact those metrics. And the fact that I am using perhaps that cloud data warehouse layer as one of the components of how I address that, then I'm at least giving some sort of attribution, if not if a somewhat hand wavy attribution to its contribution.
I think that's so clever because I think that and thinking through these questions, I sort of suspected people want to know how to measure stuff, right? That's always, at least I think that, and you know, we're always observing conversations where people talk about that, but isn't the answer what you just said, which is you have a set of metrics you already care about, customer response time, you know, being efficient to the martech stack, feeling more than 30% confident that it's used, all of these things, and you're going to make the investments in improving those metrics. It doesn't mean that this concept of digital ops needs its own family of metrics. It just means, is it relevant to the metrics that you're going after anyway?
100%.
I think that's
I mean, I'm
fantastic.
sure, like, you know, I don't know too many marketers who are like, you know, I'm feeling like I don't have enough metrics I'm keeping track of right now.
Yeah,
Could you
and
recommend
I
a
think
few more?
and I think it's a forehead wipe for a lot in our audience who are thinking, you know, I thought that maybe Scott would give me 5 more metrics on my list, but really I know what the business needs. So I'm really pleased with that. There's a question that I was going to ask you later, but you got to give the people what they want, and they are asking, where does it live? Does it live in RevOps? Does it live? Now, obviously, there's going to be organizational differences. So you can decide to answer that as what you observe and sort of how you would build an organization.
Yeah, what a great fun question. Okay. Of course, the consultant answer applies. It depends. But you've
Well,
given me an
sure.
opening to something I'm very, very passionate about. So just bear with me on a moment here.
Do it.
Uh, for years, we've talked about a phrase called big data, right? What was big data? It was like, oh my goodness, we're now in this world where we're going to have just an enormous volume of data. It's got enormous variety. It's coming at us in a high velocity, you know, and for a good 10-year period in the early mid 2000s through, you know, like, yeah, just the last decade, like this was a big topic. I mean, like, you know, any article you were going to read in the industry, you know, you had a 50-50 chance of, you know, big data coming up as part of it. We don't talk about that as much anymore, not because it's completely solved, but because we've actually kind of got our head around that now. And actually, you know, this ability to have enormous amounts of data flowing into our organization, the infrastructure and the capabilities for that, you know, are just much more accessible than they were, you know, a decade and a half ago. To me, the challenge, though, is something I would reframe as big ops. Because now that we've got all this data here, the challenge we're now running into is we have all these different teams that are running their own little apps or automations or, hey, now what's the buzzword of the week? AI agents, you know, and all this stuff that they're all operating in the same environment on top of that data, but they aren't necessarily coordinated. And so one of the reasons I framed this challenge of big ops is because I feel like, oh, we have yet to actually even get our arms around this challenge of the volume, variety, and velocity of all these apps, automations, and agents. But there's another interpretation of that big ops, which is from an organizational lens. We have marketing ops, we have sales ops, we have rev ops, depending on the size of your company. Maybe you have web ops, you have, you know, finance ops. In fact, actually, I would go so far as to say at a company of any reasonable size, whatever name you have for a department, you can tack the word ops onto the end of that department name, and there's probably someone, if not multiple people, with
Yep.
that job.
HR,
HR ops, right?
finance,
It's a real
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
You
sure.
know, and so there's when you like start to like stack these things all together, you realize, well, this is a proliferation of all these ops roles. And what's fascinating about them is if you think of it as a Venn diagram, some like really multi-dimensional Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap. Right? A lot of them are sort of orchestrating around like, okay, well, we have to make sure we're getting the right data. We validate that data. We're going to have a set of automations. We want some sort of like guardrails here. And this is, you know, what that team does. Now, where things get interesting is, yeah, that's fine for each one of these things living in their own little silo, because while they have some things in common, they have a lot of stuff that's very contextually specific to what they're doing. What we really want to do as a business, though, is we don't want to be operating in a million different ops silos. We kind of want to start to converge of this idea of like, oh no, this is just the operations of our business. This is the operations of how we engage with customers. And this is how we start to pull things together. And I would humbly suggest, you know, the movement for RevOps, you know, which for a lot of companies, they interpret it as like, okay, well, marketing ops, sales ops, customer service ops, like I need to start to pull these together under, you know, some combined framework, increasingly rev ops groups trying to get aligned with, you know, the finance ops groups. I think that's wonderful. But I think the reality is for most companies, we are still in the early stages where like there's a vast variety of these different little ops functions all throughout the business. And I don't think we've yet come to a place where we figured out how to like, should that all exist in one department? Should it all be in the ops department? Is there a grand ops department? Is it the IT department? You know, my opinion is we probably want some level of common organization there, but
Yeah.
that a lot of what makes these individual ops teams so valuable is the part of the Venn diagram that is unique to the context of what they're trying to deliver. There's no one going to be better than a marketing ops person in really understanding the subtleties of how they're orchestrating a specific marketing campaign.
Hmm. I have expected Julia to present a Venn diagram at some point while you're speaking.
Luckily, this Venn
waiting.
diagram isn't out there.
It'll arrive.
But she
I
was
know
probably
it will.
searching for it, so kudos.
It will arrive. I love the idea of big ops, and isn't it funny? There really is a maybe an evolution toward what you're describing. I know that a lot of us, guilty as charged, are patting ourselves on the back still for moving to RevOps, for saying, "Hey, that is clever. I will combine marketing and sales, and we'll think about territory planning in the context of comp planning and in the context of our segments, and thinking that's really smart. So a way to go there, but a really good way to look at that decision."
Yeah, but it is really interesting because, and all the examples you gave are actually the perfect reason why you want those things combined, because there's so much benefit to that coherence, across all of that. But then, since I'm closest on the martech side to a lot of marketing ops teams, I hear a lot of pushback from them that like, okay, yeah, well, RevOps, we agree with all those aligned things, but there's all these other things that we need to do that are actually highly specific to marketing. And the RevOps leader doesn't necessarily get that. And so I think that's one of the things we're struggling with is like, where is the balance between, what you combine, and unify around as a model, and where is differentiation in the ops models actually
Yeah,
useful and a good thing, and probably
totally.
highly variant from one company to another.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much that goes into that, including cost, right? I mean, centralization is efficient, but you make your sacrifices on the other side. So again, a lot of good commentary in terms of informing that decision for folks who are thinking about it. And they are, because again, those questions came in on chat. Um, do you have any thoughts on avoiding, this is so consistent with what you said about the Gartner survey, which we are buying into collectively here, tool sprawl.
Mm.
So I spent some time at Forrester as an analyst and talking to folks about their goals and technology purchases. And sometimes I would wonder, I don't even know if you're ready for this, right? So let's just say we're talking to someone about an intent vendor, back in 2016, and that's when this was. And you would think, okay, but if you learn that someone's in market, what will you do to treat them differently, right? Like, what's your response? What are you building in terms of campaign design? There's a lot to this, but this is just an example, a small one. Just how ready are you to adopt the tech? And so do you feel concerned about, I'm not saying people who bought that had tool sprawl, but I think the answer is tech. It's tech and talent and organization, as you laid out at the beginning of this. But I think the lowest hanging fruit there is writing a check.
Yeah, no, and I mean, again, not to paint all vendors, with the same brush. I mean, I'm aligned with a vendor myself. I mean, I think vendors were incentivized to say like, here's what's possible with this technology,
Yeah.
and we can show you a demo, and we can tell you about this customer who did that, and this was great. They've been less incentivized, I think, to say like, oh, and by the way, here's all the other things you're going to need to do to like make this really effective. And I don't even think I wouldn't want to frame this as a conspiracy sort of thing. It's more of just like, I know a lot of like great sales reps in the martech industry, and it is hard to be a sales rep in this industry because you have to learn so much about your product, so much about these contexts, And so I think, a lot of great salespeople and customer success people, even in the martech space, it was like, okay, I can explain to the customer our technology and what it does
Yeah.
and how you take advantage of that. But boy, trying to like also consult with them on like everything else they're going to need to do,
Yes.
in their organization to take full advantage of that, they just couldn't do that, which is
Yeah.
why I do think like analysts, consultants, solutions providers, like huge value, you know, having these other sources. But yeah, people, you know, you said it so eloquently. It's like, oh, I can write the check and get that because I've got
Mm,
budget. So here, let me
yeah,
do that.
but change is so much harder. It's so much
It
harder.
is,
Yeah.
you know, and you're right about, I mean, tools for all. It's funny, I'm always of two minds of that because to me, I just hate talking about the size of tech stacks as any sort of meaningful number whatsoever. Like to me, it doesn't matter if you've got 5 tools in your stack or 500 tools in your stack. What matters is, okay, for the technologies you have, are you using them well? Are you getting value out of these? You know, are they working? Like, that's all that matters. Like, it's almost like an Occam's razor. Like, you want the simplest possible martech stack that actually does the
Yeah.
things that you want to need. And so while I push back on that, I also acknowledge that, yeah, just the way a lot of tech stacks have gotten constructed over time is a lot of them are a mess. You know, there's a lot of legacy stuff. There's a lot of overlap. I'm not entirely against overlap if there's a useful reason for it, but there's
Yeah.
a lot of cases where there's overlap that there isn't a
Yeah.
useful reason for it. And it's
Yeah.
funny, wow, just one notch thought on that was, you know, because I tracked this data of like size of tech stacks through some of these SaaS management platforms, and it had been consolidating for the past 3 years. Like basically, it spiked up, you know, with the pandemic when everyone's like, "Hey, if it's digital, let's buy it." You know, but after that, it really did start to, you know, consolidate year over year until last year, where it suddenly started growing again. And as you
Mm,
might have imagined, why? It's because now people are like bringing in all these new specialist AI tools to experiment with
yeah.
that as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. Really good stuff. I definitely encourage everyone joining us to think about that as a mini simple audit in their own organizations, just the concept of utilization of their own MarTech stack. Hopefully people are kind of doing that anyway, but don't know if I've ever met someone that wouldn't benefit from a little thought there, including my own firm when
So
these come
I have
apart.
no investment in any of these companies, but I will give a plug to these SaaS management platforms, you know, like Better Cloud or Xylo, or there's a whole bunch of them. Because what they do is they plug into your environment, they connect to your finance systems, you know, your like validation, tech validation systems, and they actually will give you like a full picture of this is all the software you have. And every single time I've seen like, because it's almost like a classic setup. You can ask people what they think they have in their tech stack and how many tools and what that, and they'll give you a number. And then you'll get this report on what they actually have in their org. And it's not unusual for it to be 10x. I mean, not 2x, 3x. I'm talking like
Mm-hmm.
10x the size. And people are like, wait, what? Oh my God. You know, and then at least you've got a set of truth where you're like,
Yeah.
okay, now let's sort of go through these one by one and like, what do we need? What are we using? What's a waste?
Totally. It reminds me of the commercial, and I don't know who it is, but it's a consumer commercial that says, "We're going to find how many subscriptions you have." And someone says, "I have two," but they don't. They have 20. They have 10x. Absolutely fascinating. And I think the plugs are so useful. I know I don't have those tools on my radar. I know that. Thank you for sharing that. Do you think that the concept of digital ops orchestration um, is in itself, if applied well, an alignment tool? How do you think it could become a tool or a concept that aligns the marketing and sales revenue? I know we chat a little bit about HR ops, but I'm not going to hold you to that. But a little bit of, does this concept, like what can we borrow from this concept, if not the full thing, to say that there's alignment value here, if there is
Yeah.
any?
So if we go back to that, you know, situation we're chatting about with big ops of just all these different things running agents, automation apps independent of each other, but having interaction effects with each other, sometimes not even realizing it. It is very clear that is a problem. And what's happening here is with this explosion of AI agents of all varieties, shapes, and forms, that's only accelerating. Like it's now multiplying. And the problems are going to continue now to actually accelerate as part of that too. So I think it is for 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 this digital AI world for business to not devolve into absolute and total chaos, we need some sort of like governance system around that. You know, there are different models that people are talking about. You know, the most easy one conceptually is we already have anchor platforms, in our stack, whether it's like, our CRM or our customer engagement platform or our CDP. And there's a case to be made that those platforms, particularly in the near term, are actually ideal to like, okay, you really want them to serve as the arbiters. So like if you're going to have like multiple agents or automations or workflows, any of that, you want to bring it all into those systems, and that then provides, like a single place to make sure things are staying in sync. Now, where that gets challenging is, again, like that can actually work in the context of, like marketing or sales or, some products, right? Cross both of those worlds. And so they can do that. But then as you start to get into other more adjacent spaces, like, oh, well, let's say whatever digital product we're running, whether it's a web app or a mobile app or something like that. Okay, that tends to now start to enter into a slightly different domain where we might be running other kinds of software that, manages the experiences that happen there. And so we have to start to find some way to connect them. Now, again, you can still try and do that in those like core, customer platforms. This is what I do at HubSpot with like integrations to HubSpot is so that HubSpot can do that with these other tools. So that's one model. I think there's another model that's not well. All right, there's another model which is these. I'm going to give you three models. So that was the first one. The second one is the use of these tools that we'll call them workflow automation platforms. And these are like, on more of the SMB side, companies like Zapier, on more of the, enterprise side, companies like Workato. These were companies that started out initially as what they call integration platform as a service, iPaaS, but really what they were, building out and they've leaned more into is saying like, oh, well, we can let you like automate processes that span the boundaries of multiple products. And both Zapier and Workato, actually, if you go to their websites now, I think they're all leaning into saying, oh, well, you don't just build automations with our stuff, you can build agents with our stuff. And so you could see those tools have a claim in the game to be the ones orchestrating across this. And then the third model, which is the one that is future leaning, a lot of talk, not a lot of implementation out there today, is this idea of actually, AI agents and almost this idea of master AI agents that control networks of other AI agents. I will give a small plug. Dharmesh Shah, who's the co-founder of HubSpot, actually has a project he's running called Agent AI, letting people build and list agents and all do this. And he framed it as like, oh, this is a professional network for AI agents so that, AI agents could discover each other and maybe do things together. These models are super interesting as like, oh, wow, is this some future of how things get orchestrated across the business? But we're not there. We're not anywhere near there today. And so I don't know, it's those three models and there's probably a sequence in them.
So helpful. I love that you mentioned governance at the beginning. I think that it's so easy to hear governance and think bureaucratic and process heavy, and sort of slowing things down without reciprocal value for it. But I do think we said earlier, change management is the hard part. I think sometimes governance can be the tool that helps that.
Yeah, and governance is hard. It is, and it's one of
almost
those
needs a
things
rebrand.
that's not loved,
It needs a rebrand. Maybe we'll give that some thought, Scott. What about privacy? Any concerns, anything folks should think about from your perspective in terms of the rise of digital ops as we're discussing it, and the idea of privacy? And it's a big topic, and we've got
Yeah,
limited
as it
time.
should.
I know you have a lot to say about it. But
Well,
what's
I
your
think,
view on
we were talking earlier about, if I was going to give one piece of advice on where to invest, it would be in the data and the data layer. And actually privacy and compliance is one of those reasons, is because, there is some question about privacy that is very contextual of like, how is it being used in that context? But to be honest, the rock solid foundation of it is we need to know who are we talking to, what permissions do we have to talk to them? What sort of that history of, those engagements are. And that all has to come into some sort of centralized data platform. If it's siloed in different places. This is where we get ourselves in trouble, is like, if the marketing team thinks it has one set of rights to talk to people, but then the customer success team thinks they're going to run some, recommended promotion, not even trying to do it commercially. They're probably even trying to like help, folks with it, but it's, what do they call it? It's not a transactional, communication here. It's like a promotional one. And they're just desynced. And, now we're violating the expectations, and in some cases, actually the law, of what people, expected. So I think if you can get this down into a common data layer, and so that today, every one of these major app platforms can sort of use that to update, the preferences of, the audience, but then also being able to read that and use that as their decisions. And then when you start thinking about this proliferation of agents, again, all of those agents should be like going to that same source of data to like, okay, what is the authoritative source of truth on what our privacy expectations are with each and every individual that we engage with?
Yep. So you said the words customer data platform in order. So you said it.
Oh, should
And
I
then you
spin
said,
around and like, do a hex or, okay, yeah.
and then you said, authoritative source of truth. Super important concepts here. You alluded to them earlier in the conversation. And someone asked, how is the siloed data being synthesized to provide meaningful and actionable information? And this goes back to, you talked about anchor parts of the martech stack. I think that's a big part of the answer, but it's really for you. I'm wondering what you want to tell folks about CDPs and where they live potentially as a source of truth versus some of those more anchor pieces of the martech stack, like the CRM and marketing automation.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a survey of how people were thinking of their martech stack architecture about a year ago. And one of the questions was this really hand-wavy simple thing of what do you consider to be the center of your stack? And it was interesting that for B2B companies, it was typically the CRM, and then to a lesser degree, like the marketing automation platform. For the B2C companies, the most common answer was actually the CDP.
Very interesting. Very
And so it's, there's just some variance in how people have thought about that.
Yeah.
The CDP space has been going through a lot of really interesting changes, because like you've had like in the past couple of years, this movement of composable CDPs, which essentially means like, oh, your data exists in that cloud data warehouse, and the CDP is just sort of putting like a activation organizational layer on top. And then you've had a bunch of very recent acquisitions in the CDP space where these like major systems of engagement have gone ahead and actually acquired CDPs because they're like, hey, listen, the way in which we think about these data models, it's entangled, in how we actually, engage with customers. But to me, I think the way I look at it is if we weren't talking about AI every minute of every day as the big change in our world.
Oh, the time we would have back in our day.
Yes, the time we would have. But what I think would be recognizing is a really transformational shift in marketing tech stacks and tech stacks in general is this ascendancy of the cloud data warehouse, the cloud data lakehouse. Because for so long, so much data was always locked up in all these different apps, and silos, and we've steadily been getting to a world where as companies implement these, warehouses and lakehouses, they first of all make sure that all data starts to filter down into that, so it's available in one layer. But also increasingly, apps are getting better and better at being able to then pull data, out from that layer when they want to do something with it. And so to me, this is really exciting, but it's funny. The way I would frame it is like the dog who catches the car. For years, marketers could complain legitimately like, we don't have access to the data. There's all this data out there and we don't have access to it. Along comes the cloud data warehouse, all the data forms into it, and they're like, great, we have access to all the data. And oh my God, because it's a mess. It turns out all the data isn't actually very well organized. It's conflicting, like understanding like what's up to date. If you have, two different records that think two different opposite things, how do you decide between them? And so we've moved from one problem to now a new problem. And I think it's in that new problem where the concept of things like CDPs are still incredibly relevant, which is to say like, hey, even if all the data is somehow at a storage level down there in the universal, cloud data warehouse or cloud data lakehouse. In the context of marketing, we actually do need the ability to say like, okay, we want to know what is actually the records of truth, for particular things. In fact, what we were talking about, like for privacy, like I really do need to know exactly, what customer, has said they want a particular preference of how we engage with them. I don't want to guess on that. I need the real,
Mhm.
the real answer, And so you try and get these CDPs to help provide a context and some governance, we won't use that word again, but some of this like structure on
Yeah.
top of that data. And that's where I think whether a CDP stays independent and then it's a sort of a middle layer that can then push things up into systems of engagement,
Yeah.
or what we've seen with some of these, like rash of acquisitions, in the CDP space where people are just sort of moving that into the engagement system itself. I think either of those can work, but it's this idea of saying, I still actually do need some sort of way to manage the data
Yeah.
in a more structured way than what I have at the cloud data warehouse layer.
Yeah. The analogy of the dog saying what, asking the dog, what will you do if you catch this is absolutely perfect. Really clever. You've spoken, I think you've spoken and written a bit about systems of record and systems of engagement. I think that's worth folks digging into. We can't ask you to go into all that right now because I see some folks entering the room, and that tells me, oh, we definitely have time for another question or two. So I'm going to keep going until Julia gives me a.
And thanks for bearing with me as I ramble endlessly on some of it. You have very precise questions, and I have very rambling answers. So
The
you're very
last
patient
thing I
with me.
want to
Thank
do
you.
is force you into any corners. No, this is great. Thank you so much. We talked about who owns digital ops, and we had a lot of good conversations there. I think that what I would close on is asking you if you have predictions. So I always hated this question. I'll be honest with you. So I'm doing you such a disservice.
Thank you.
But and such a disservice. And yet I'm doing it. But in terms of digital ops orchestration, everything people came here to hear about, you talked about what Dharmesh Shah is working on as something futuristic. Totally buy into that. Obviously, I buy into that in the sense that what was once future is now here. I started my career posting dioramas at the airport because that's how you marketed, right? So learned digital marketing from Marketo and HubSpot and the vendors in those days. And so what is sort of 3 to 5 years ahead? What sort of problems that we talk about today that you think might get solved? So first, we didn't have access to the data, and we didn't know what to do with it. But in 3 to 5 years, any other splendid things that we might solve as revenue marketers? Anything we should be scared of?
All right, so I will offer something, but with this very large caveat that the pace at which things are changing. I mean, it's always hard to predict the future. If I could do that really well, I should start a hedge fund, but it is especially hard to predict the future at this point. There's just so much changing so rapidly. So all I can offer would be my guess. And I think the things I would guess that are a lot of reason to be very optimistic about where this may end up with is, it's funny, we were talking like so much about the tech stack, and I've got these specific tools and how they relate to each other and what does this do? And it's hard and it's complex. And what's really interesting is there's this movement happening with AI where the ability to create software is just getting easier and easier. And we see these like Gen AI interfaces where you don't even have to know a programming language. You just describe in natural language what you want, and the software goes ahead and writes a little program, and executes it for you. And maybe you never even see the code. And a lot of what those things are today are simple versions. This is Clay Christensen, Disruptive Innovation. It's starting with the real low-end use cases. But you can sort of draw an extrapolation there and say like, wait, are we headed to a world where when I want to do something, I don't have to go and track down a specific tool and learn its particular menu structures and UX and incantations to get things done, but that I can sort of at a level above that be able to just like, hey, here's what I'm looking to do, or here's what I want, and have an agent actually then do the work behind the scenes to like, okay, dynamically create an experience for me that calls the right services, pulls the right data, and actually executes that directly. I mean, this sounds like something that is very science fiction like today, but you start to see the hints of what people are doing with small use cases up to that today, and it's not inconceivable. And I think the reason I get so excited about that is, we'll close on that Gartner thing of like, oh man, people utilizing 33% of their martech stack. They just feel like there's more tech here than I will ever figure out how to use. Is if we actually get to this place where the agents provide a layer that we simply describe what we're actually looking for in outcomes, and they're figuring out how to like take advantage of this amazing tech infrastructure to execute on that, that for the first time in now the 25-year history of martech, we could have
Yeah.
the thing that systems are both getting more sophisticated and actually getting much easier to use. And that would be a pretty wild thing.
Massive, massive unlock. Massive unlock that would be. I could do this all day, Scott. I
Well,
know
you're
we
very
can't.
kind. This has been great chatting with you, Allison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great for me too. Julia, thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you guys here.
It
And
was really insightful. Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you so much, Scott. Before we wrap things up, we still have 2 minutes. So
okay,
how about you both share your prediction for 2025 when it comes to digital ops, orchestration, and AI?
I'll go first
Not gonna be
because
solved in 2025.
I was going to say I'll go first just because I already said to Scott what an unfair question and gave it to him anyway. So I appreciate that you turned it back to me. That makes sense. I don't think that it will be solved, but man, what I will tell you is I often say to myself whenever I'm in ChatGPT, as an extremely amateur user, this is the best $20 a month I spend. I can't believe I write this huge check to Comcast and get this for $20 from ChatGPT. So I think one of the things that we'll find is with people like me having access to tools like this at what I call consumer prices or super accessible prices. I'm not expensing this. I'm not thinking about, and I know that everyone else does too. And maybe I want to write my own blog post and I'll go have a generative AI make my image. I think we'll find that we didn't pay a ton of attention to the G word. Scott, we'll think of a different word for it, the governance word, to kind of say, hey, you can, we still have brand standards, right? We really still care about that. Maybe we're a bit rigid about it. We still care that if you are, using ChatGPT to write an email to a customer, that maybe we want to have some collective organizational thoughts on that, right? Just because you're using a tool that is sort of unsanctioned. So it sounds a bit rigid, but I do think we'll find that we get in a mild amount of trouble in each individual organization by not having a little more conversation about the rules of the game and how each of us is going to bring our own consumer tools to our workplace and even using it for things like speed and things that are generally really, really good, but also I never met an IT department that kind of said, go do your own thing. I don't care. That's not how that works. So I think we'll think about that and see what that looks like in 2025. And Scott, part of me having a long answer was giving you some room to breathe because we just pummeled you for an
That
hour.
was a brilliant answer, Allison. I'll just +1 that.
Thank you so much, both. Such a pleasure. How can our community support you if best? Scott, martech, journal?
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, by the way, one of the things we're running for martech right now is every year we run a contest we call the Stackies. We invite marketers to send in a single slide that illustrates their martech stack, however they want, however they think about it. We actually make donations. There's no fee to enter. We make a donation to a nonprofit for every legit entry we get. So if you're willing and able to share, I mean, so many of the changes Allison and I were talking about, like stacks are evolving. How people are thinking about them is evolving. So my one ask would be to consider, yeah, sending something into the Stackies and sharing with the community, like, how is your stack evolving?
Allison, how about yourself?
Yeah, if you're waiting for me, it's a total +1. Those are fascinating to see. It helps folks like Scott contribute to sessions like this in a tremendously meaningful and insightful way. So please do that. Please do that.
Thank you again. And we are transitioning to our next panel.
Amazing.